The Marinid dynasty, which I would be simply calling Morocco, and the Emirate of Granada were positioned in the south of Iberia, and just like their predecessors, they wanted to restore Al-Andalus. Initially they were very successful, as in 1333 they managed to take Gibraltar, then successfully repel several attempts by the Castilians to take the rock. However, Morocco and Granada weren't always on the same team, and after Morocco gave Granada Gibraltar in 1374, in 1411 they fought each other, where Morocco lost and didn't regain Gibraltar, then they themselves collapsed into civil wars. Thus the Christians in Iberia eventually managed to complete the Reconquista in 1492, fully kicking the Muslims out, and even expanding into them later on. However, what if all of this was reversed and the Reconquista as a whole had failed? This is not too unlikely to happen, as by this point the Muslims had built up momentum, while the Castilian Civil War would start in 1351 and finish in 1369, which could have been exploited by the Muslims in this alternate history. Further, Castile and Aragon weren't unified just yet, and the Black Death did cause a lot of trouble in Iberia, which the Muslims could leverage if they didn't lose a key battle in 1340. Will the Muslims be able to restore Al-Andalus, or are they going to be eventually crusaded and destroyed? Make your bets now and let me show you what I came up with. First up, some brief context. The Moroccans were initially doing great against the Christians in Iberia. Earlier I mentioned the siege of Gibraltar in 1333, where the Muslim coalition of Morocco and Granada had succeeded, but I want to go a little in depth just to show you how incompetent Castile was at the time. Let me go back to the beginning of the 14th century, where the Castilians had retaken Gibraltar from Granada in 1309. Then Granada tried to retake it in 1315 but had failed. This made communications between Granada and Morocco even more difficult, and their alliance had somewhat collapsed. Abu al-Hassan Ali ibn Othman, one of the most prominent Moroccan leaders, revived the alliance, and in 1333 they laid siege to Gibraltar, where Castile was busy with the coronation of Alfonso XVIII, making their response very slow. Historically, Gibraltar was not prepared for the siege by the Muslims, and the local governor Vasco Perez de Meira of Galicia is the one to blame for that. He stole from the funds allocated by Castile to pay for food and maintenance of the defenses, where instead he bought lands for himself. He also didn't use the food properly, where instead of giving it to his garrisons, he sometimes sold it to the enemy, further enriching himself. Meanwhile, Granada was making incursions into Castile, occupying their attention and allowing for Morocco to fight the garrisons in Gibraltar, where Castile couldn't resupply them. Alfonso XI did try to convince his vassals to send help, but these negotiations only gave Morocco more time to besiege Gibraltar. 4 months after the siege had started, Castile finally could do something about it and put a relief force, but this was difficult, as the Castilian advisors were against intervening, fearing that this could escalate into a full-scale war. After 9 days of time wasted arguing with each other, Alfonso got his way and positioned his army close to Gibraltar, but by that time it was already too late. The garrisons and the townspeople were suffering greatly. They literally had to eat their own shields, belts and shoes, because they were made out of leather, which had some calories. This goes to show that the amount of hunger in Gibraltar was truly insane. It got so bad that Castile literally attempted to catapult food inside the town walls, but the Muslims successfully stopped them. On the 17th of June 1333, the town finally surrendered by Vasco Perez de Meira of Galicia, the guy that stole all the money that needed to buy food and instead bought land for himself. He was also hoarding food while the siege was ongoing, and while his people were eating the leather from their shields, he had enough food to feed the whole population for 5 days. He later fled to North Africa and escaped Castilian punishment, while the Muslims relatively easily took Gibraltar. Immediately after that, the Castilian army under Alfonso XI finally made their way to Gibraltar, but by that time they had already lost the fortification, so they had to besiege it, rather than to relieve it. While the Castilians defeated 500 Moors near Sierra Carbonera, Alfonso XI ordered his soldiers not to chase the fleeing Moroccan army, but they disobeyed their orders. Then Castile was ready to nearly invade Gibraltar, where the first wave would land, then protect the second wave. Only then would they together take sieging positions. The problem was that the Castilian soldiers disobeyed their command once more, and the first wave directly went to besiege Gibraltar, leaving the second wave very vulnerable. Thus, the Moroccans managed to eliminate most of the second wave right on the beaches, and now the first wave of 1500 soldiers was basically trapped in Morocco. Morocco positioned their navy to blockade the straits, which made the Castilian resupply their lost soldiers almost impossible, as the Castilian army had only one day worth of food and the winds were not favorable for a naval battle. They opted to retreat and abandon the 1,500 soldiers there. However, it is not known exactly what happened after that, but the Castilians ended up changing their mind, with Alfonso XI being credited as managing to convince his nobles that it would be dishonorable to let their soldiers to die, so the Castilians opted to try again. So they did the smart thing and decided to literally do the same thing again. Same landing beaches, same everything. The only thing that they decided to change was to execute it more properly. Sure, they made landings on the west side of the rock, where they were unable to do anything meaningful, developing into a 2-month stalemate, where both armies were lacking in food. Some Castilians wanted to defect to the side of Morocco, but instead they were captured and sold as slaves, for 1/8 the price of a cow. Holy shit, the medieval times were something else. So, while both sides were sitting around and starving, 3 Castilian subjects revolted, while Alfonso XI was far from home. In the end, a 4-year truce was signed, and Morocco officially kept the rock. But you may wonder why I spent so much time covering these 2 sieges, when they succeeded for the Muslims in our history. Well, this is because Muhammad IV of Granada was assassinated by his nobility the day after signing the truce. Muhammad IV was killed because his nobility feared that he was leaning too much into an alliance with Morocco and feared that they may be subjugated and lose their privileges, while before this point Granada and Morocco were very separate, sometimes even not allied at all, and later on were also fighting each other. Another theory of his assassination is that Muhammad IV, when signing the peace treaty with Castile, had dined with Alfonso XI, where they exchanged gifts, where Muhammad IV gave him a very expensive gold-plated sword with gemstones, and the gift he received in return was a doublet. Yeah, a jacket. Now his nobles were pissed that he dined with a Christian and feared that he may have converted to Christianity, hence why they decided to kill him. While his assassination was positive in the decades thereafter, as his brother Yusuf I succeeded him, who is remembered as one of the most competent rulers of Granada, in the short term it didn't allow for the Muslims to expand any further, which is exactly the reason why they lost the next and most important battle, the Battle of Rio Salado. Before that, the Battle of Vega de Pagana also took place, where Abu Malik, the son of Abu al-Hassan Ali ibn Uthman, the ruler of Morocco, landed in Iberia to reinforce Muslim positions. Alfonso XI didn't want to let the Muslims to entrench themselves, so he chose to confront them. Unfortunately, almost nothing is known about this battle, but what is the most important part is that Abu Malik was killed, and he was the general who had reconquered Gibraltar from Castile. This threw the Muslims in the region into a state of panic, as they lost their competent general, governor, and future monarch of Morocco, so this was a big blow. Now the Battle of Rio Salado was a win for both sides. If the Muslims won, they could reverse the Christian gains in the past century. However, if the Christians had won, they could have neutralized the Muslims as a threat. There, the Muslims had initial success, winning a naval battle and destroying part of the Castilian navy. Then they moved to Iberia and besieged the town of Tarifa, the southernmost town of Castile and even Spain today, excluding the Canary Islands. The problem is that the Muslims made a few critical mistakes, thinking that the Castilians would take several months to rebuild their navy, so Morocco wanted to not overspend on this war, and as such the Moroccan navy was sent home. Alfonso XI was assisted by Aragon and Portugal in this crusade against the Muslims, where they sent many ships and even Genoa took part, which were used to blockade the Straits of Gibraltar and prevent the Muslims from resupplying their army that was besieging Tarifa. On the 10th of October 1340, the Muslims almost took the town of Tarifa as they ordered a charge, which was expensive for both sides. As the town was not taken, the Muslims were in a very bad position, which got even worse as the King of Portugal, Alfonso IV, also joined Alfonso XI of Castile, and combined they had an army of 20,000 soldiers. Upon the Moroccans learning of this, they abandoned their siege of Tarifa and occupied the nearby highlands, waiting for the enemy to advance. Both armies stood 4.5 kilometers from each other, where in between there was a valley. Both sides were lacking in supplies, which made Alfonso XI want to attack sooner. 4,000 Christian soldiers were sent to relieve Tarifa, but due to miscommunications, the Muslims didn't know that somebody was behind their back, as they were told that no Christians made their way to Tarifa. It is unknown how many soldiers were on each side, as some sources say that there were 653,000 Muslims, while others say it was 10 times less, which is 67,000. By many historians it is considered as the largest Muslim army to ever land in Iberia since the 700s. I would be using the latter source, which also said that the Christians had 22,000 soldiers, so the Muslims at least outnumbered them 3 to 1, no matter which sources we use. What happened is that the Muslims left their camp, ready to attack, and the Christians simultaneously attacked the camp, while the Muslims didn't know about the 4,000 Christian soldiers in Tarifa, so unknowingly to them they were actually encircled. Alfonso XI was also isolated as his armies were spread out, so both sides committed large mistakes in this battle. Alfonso XI was ready to engage in this battle, but the Archbishop of Toledo grabbed him and stopped him, which allowed the Christian army to consolidate better. The battle lasted for 3 hours and resulted in a Christian victory, with all odds stacked against them, considering how much they were outnumbered. There, the Christians showed no mercy and killed and captured many Muslim prominent peoples, like the wives of the Moroccan leader. His son, nephew and sister were all taken as hostage, and his rich camp was looted by the Christians. With this decisive defeat, the Muslims later retreated back to Africa. Further, no Muslim army ever invaded Iberia ever again. Now I could cover how the Battle of Estepona, Siege of Algeciras and even the 5th Siege of Gibraltar went, but this information wouldn't be helpful for our scenario, as by this point the Moroccans would have lost either way, so turning the Siege of Algeciras around wouldn't mean much. Basically, the Moroccans were out of the war, but Granada continued to fight the Christians for 10 more years, where they lost some parts to the west of their country, namely Algeciras, which was on the other side of Gibraltar, and was very important for regional trade, giving the Christians total control over the Straits of Gibraltar. Some minor towns were also lost, like Priego and Takawa Real, but also the Moroccans had basically lost everything in Iberia, with the borders in the end looking something like this. Gibraltar was still in the hands of Morocco, however. As I said earlier, the Moroccans never made it to Iberia ever again. They were practically fully kicked out, while Granada is said to have survived as a Castilian vassal or tribute-paying state for about 150 years, until their final conquest in 1492. This is important for our scenario, as after this battle the Muslims had basically zero chance at reconquering Iberia and restoring Al-Andalusia, where slowly but surely they were eventually kicked out. The alliance between Morocco and Granada was effectively ended right here, and they even fought each other in 1411 in the 6th Siege of Gibraltar, where Morocco historically lost. So it is this conflict between the two Muslim powers that later allowed Castile to kick them out fully and form Spain, with the Portuguese even taking Ceuta and Melilla in 1415 and 1419 respectively. This further shattered Morocco, and their control over Algeria and Tunisia was weakened greatly, while local tribes had stopped paying taxes to the central government, and Abu al-Hassan even lost his power several times. Later on, the Marinid dynasty became plagued by coups and succession crises. Economically, the country was broke, as they spent so much on their Iberian campaigns, and in the end they were fully kicked out. Due to the Christians getting Algeciras, they had more influence over the Straits and eventually dominated trade there, making Morocco even poorer. The final part is very disputed, but some sources claim that Morocco at one point was very dependent on Granada for food and money, which just goes to show how broken they had become, and eventually the Marinid dynasty was overthrown, and Morocco ceased to be a regional power for the time being. With that context out of the way, I say we make a few key changes that would allow Morocco to win several important battles, later paving the way for their success. As to remind you, this could all be possible due to the Castilian Civil War and the Black Death wrecking Europe mostly, and the fact is that Castile and Aragon weren't unified just yet. Starting off with the 3rd Siege of Gibraltar, where the Castilian governor hoarded food and was playing both sides. Originally the Moroccans won there in just 4 months, but I think that we can alter this to be an easier victory, which would snowball greatly down the line. This is because right after they won in Gibraltar, the Castilians arrived and besieged them again. Still, Morocco was able to defend themselves at heavy cost, but this peace treaty was not too favorable for them, as historically, even though they kept the territory, officially it was purchased from Castile, rather than conquered from war, plus Muhammad IV of Granada was killed as a result of this treaty. Despite the Muslims winning both of these conflicts, there are still some changes we can make that would be more advantageous for them down the line. The first change is in 1333, where the Muslims were besieging Gibraltar. The Christians inside were starving enough to eat their shoes and belts, but it could have gone even worse for them. Historically, as to prior to the siege, a ship carrying grain had crashed nearby, which grain was retrieved and the town was fed for a while. If we simply altered the ship crashing slightly more out in the ocean, then it could be retrieved by Morocco instead, which means that they'll take Gibraltar slightly sooner, just before the Castilian army would arrive. By this point, Alfonso XI would be on his way, but it could have been further delayed by Juan Manuel, the Prince of Vallena, refusing to send in troops, where historically he had to be persuaded. This is because Juan Manuel was actually planning to rebel, which if he did here, would be very beneficial for the narrative of the scenario. Basically, he rebels instead of collaborating with Castile, which would occupy much of the Castilian attention. Thus, when Alfonso XI finally shows up to Gibraltar in this alternate history, he can debate if he even engages in the Fourth Siege of Gibraltar, which he historically lost. This is because in this alternate history the Moroccans would have had several extra months to entrench themselves in the town and repair the damages they had done while they were sieging it, making it less likely for Castile to want to take the risk. For our scenario, it would be very beneficial if they still decide to attack, and the 1500 Christian soldiers would be trapped there like historically. As Alfonso XI was already thinking of leaving and not sending in a second wave, he could do that if he decides not to listen to the Archbishop of Toledo, who convinced him historically. Thus, Castile would abandon Gibraltar after losing a few thousand soldiers, but most importantly a lot of prestige, and Alfonso XI becomes more unpopular with the nobility. As such, in the peace treaty, it would be way more favorable for the Muslims, who still expand like historically, but they would not pay for the purchase of Gibraltar, plus they can secure a lot more trade concessions, which Alfonso XI would have to grant them, due to his vassals being more rebellious, and he needs to focus on them. Now, these may be minor changes so far, but Muhammad IV of Granada is still alive and not replaced by his brother Yusuf I, who despite being more competent created tensions in Granada, which the Christian exploited 6 years later and decisively won the Battle of Río Salado. Sure, Muhammad IV of Granada is considered as more incompetent, but the stability is needed at this time more when Castile was looking to avenge their losses, which could prevent the disaster of the Battle of Vega de Pagana, where Abu Malik doesn't lose his life in this alternate history, and he was a very important general, keeping which alive could benefit us in the next battle and could change the tides of history. Now, in the year of 1340, the Battle of Río Salado would commence, but we can make some major differences as to boost the odds of the narrative of the video being achieved. The first mistake by the Muslims was sending their fleet home after defeating the Castilian navy, but not considering the fact that Aragon, Portugal and Genoa may help them out. This I think makes sense, as prior to that these nations had never supported Castile in their wars against the Muslims and were even hostile to each other. The thing is that the Europeans love to crusade, which they had done several times in history before this point, so this was just foolish thinking from the Moroccan side. How we get them to reverse this decision may very well lie with Abu Malik not being killed in the previous battle, where he was the most prominent general and succeeded in capturing Gibraltar in 1333, so he could change the opinion of the Moroccans to not send their navy home, and don't get to win the battle by spending as less as possible, because we know from our history it couldn't happen. So, as a result of that, this could make the Aragonese and Portuguese less excited to send in their navy to Castile, seeing how they could lose it as well. Plus, Europe was heating up with the 100 Years' War starting between England and France, so these two may decide to limit their involvement in the war and not aid Castile, which at the time was still kind of a rival to both countries. For example, Portugal and Castile had fought several times, most recently in the Luso-Castilian War of 1336 to 1339, so literally 1 year before this battle had started. That's why the neighbors of Castile may not be looking to support them in this conflict, although they would also fear the rise of the Muslims. With that, Morocco is in a stronger position, led by the competent Abu Malik. Muhammad IV of Granada is also alive, which also stabilizes his realm and such, so they can launch more incursions into Castile as to distract them, while the Moroccans would besiege Tarifa. I think that we have maximized the odds of the Muslims winning this very decisive battle, and to maximize them even further we need to go centuries back, so for the purpose of this video it is enough. Now, in this alternate siege of Tarifa, I think that the Muslims can succeed here, because historically they almost did. Here the odds of their victory would be way better off, so I would have it happen here. This means that Morocco would now have more control over the straits, and have won a decisive naval battle against Castile, making them resupply their armies way easier than historically. Meanwhile, Alfonso XI of Castile would be on his own, so he would have an army of 20,000 soldiers rather than 22,000, which he had historically with the help of his allies, so 10% lower, while Morocco is not blockaded, so they can increase their presence in Iberia to about 100,000 soldiers rather than 67,000, so I don't think that this is too unrealistic. So the Muslims in this alternate battle of Río Salado would outnumber the Castilians to about 5 to 1, while also they would have taken Tarifa and are not worried about their flank, something that costed them the battle historically. Here it would also commence in early October 1340, and after 3 hours of brutal fighting, the Muslims would emerge as the victors, where later they could ravage the south of Castile, perhaps raiding as far as Cordoba, where they would loot the local towns and cities, enriching themselves and paying for the war. At this point, Castile has to sue for peace, due to again their vassals being more rebellious, so they would have to sign yet another peace treaty and focus on their internal issues. For the sake of this alternate history, Alfonso XI would be alive and would sign this treaty in 1345, which I would host in the town of Huelva. There, the Muslims have decisively won, riding on their momentum of winning the previous siege of Gibraltar. Their expansion into Iberia would thus continue, and only later on you would see why this is a big deal. So for this treaty, I would have it be rather harsh on the Castilian side, since they cannot resist in any way and have to accept whatever is requested, due to their hopeless internal situation. First up, Morocco would take Tarifa, Cadiz, Jerez de la Frontera, and Sevilla, where Huelva would now become a Castilian bordering town to Morocco, which is on the other side of the Rio Tinte river. Further, Granada would also expand north until they reach the Sierra Morena mountain range, but not take Cordoba just yet, and also they're going to expand eastwards until they reach the Segura river. Basically, both sides would expand into Andalusia, but have not taken the entirety of the region just yet, and with that, this is the peace treaty, literally reversing the Christian gains in the past century, but the troubles for them are just the beginning. Before I go over to Castile, I want to talk about the Muslims and how they would be altered. Morocco is now in the best shape of their history so far. They have achieved the most territory in Africa in their history and are very much present in the south of Iberia, controlling the Gibraltar, Tarifa, Algeciras choke points on the straits, further helping them with regional trade. Also, this may be a fact that may surprise you, but initially Morocco was supported by plenty of Muslims in Iberia, which remained there from the presence of the Caliphate of Cordoba. These Muslims later emigrated over to Morocco and fought against Castile. This is to say that a noticeable chunk of the lands that Morocco and Granada would occupy in this alternate history would be lands where the locals would welcome them, while those that wouldn't would be expelled or killed or sold into slavery. You know, the typical stuff in the late medieval times. Furthermore, by Morocco winning this battle, they have changed the course of history, as they would keep their legitimacy, avoid the civil wars that destroyed them historically, creating a huge snowball effect in their favor. Granada would still be ruled by Muhammad IV, but he would eventually die and be replaced by his more competent brother Yusuf I, so the Muslims in this alternate history are greatly strengthened. But what about Castile? Well, to put it simply, the Castilians are absolutely cooked. Literally, they would be on fire. The rebellious vassals would manage to get more autonomy and privileges for themselves, further weakening the central Castilian authority. There would be plenty of internal issues right off the bat of them losing the war, but don't you worry, it would actually get worse than you can expect. The year right now in this alternate history scenario is 1345, and 2 years later the Black Death would enter Europe, where the year after that it would hit Castile, and this is very important. Apart from the millions of civilians that would lose their lives, more on that later, Alfonso XI of Castile, their leader when Castile was Gibraltar and so much of the south of Andalusia, would get sick from the Black Plague and eventually had died, and he was the most prominent people to die from the plague historically. Now, if you remember from earlier, I said that Castile had a civil war, which was from 1351 to 1369, literally lasting 18 years. It was caused because of the death of Alfonso XI due to the Black Plague, and there were two candidates for the Castilian throne. Peter was supported by Britain, while Henry of Trastamara was supported by France, and this was like a proxy war during the 100 Years' War. As Castile is now much more destroyed, they can surely see even more unrest, so the civil war as a whole would become a lot more brutal than historically, while the Muslims down south would just consolidate their power and grow stronger, benefiting from trade. Further, Granada historically supported Peter in the civil war, as they feared that France and Castile allying would be troublesome, while Castile and Tinguant allying would be more tolerable, due to distance. Historically, the pro-French Henry of Trastamara came out on top, but here it would be much more contested, as the Muslims would likely support the losing side, which is the pro-British Peter, just so they can further weaken Castile and later on invade them. Historically, this Castilian Civil War also coincided with the Castilian-Aragonese War of 1356 to 1369, where Peter of Castile also fought against Aragon, not just Henry who was supported by France. So of these wars right after the Black Death left Iberia very much destroyed. As I said, in our history, the Muslims were mostly kicked out and contained, so historically they couldn't take advantage of all of this chaos in Iberia, but in this alternate history it is very much different. They would be more wealthy and ready to strike Castile during these dire times of their history. Now let me cover the effects of the Black Death more precisely, where to be honest we have no idea of the true numbers, but according to flawed sources, here is what I managed to find. Castile lost about half of their population, going from 3 million people to 1.5 million, while Granada went from 300,000 to 150,000, and Morocco went from 1.5 million to 750,000. I'm simply using a 50% mortality rate to calculate this, but of course this can be very much flawed. I'm not going to cover how this reshaped societies historically, as it is not important for this scenario, but I can focus on few major events that would aid in the narrative of the video. First up, while Castile lost a lot of people, in the end it was positive for them, as the peasants got more rights and this positively reshaped Castile politically, later on making them the dominant superpower that we know them today. The thing is that Castile here is so devastated that they may not reach these heights. Let me explain. The Christians were horrified by the Black Death, and the church values didn't save them from all of this devastation, so many people started to question Christianity and sought to reform it, wondering why God would kill so many people and destroy so many lives. Here in this alternate history, the people of Castile could begin to blame Alfonso XI for the Black Death, seeing it as a sign of God punishing them for losing so much lands to the Muslims, which I think is quite possible for the people to think like that. Combine this with the Castilian Civil War, plus their war with Aragon, plus their losses to the south of Andalusia, plus Granada no longer paying tribute to Castile but is actually fighting against them, plus Castile in the 1340s was described as having a poor country with arid soil and underdeveloped agriculture, and the situation all of a sudden would become a lot more dire for Castile, just with the Muslims winning one simple battle. For the Muslims it is not great either, don't get me wrong. Granada especially relied on cheap labor, which was killed en masse with the Black Death, so in turn killing their economy. Morocco was historically very hit hard as well, but here in this alternate history it could be much less devastating. Historically, Morocco had defeated Tlemcen and Tunis, where they sort of annexed these territories. As Morocco was defeated in the Battle of Río Salado and kicked out of Iberia, the subjects of Morocco revolted as to exploit this weakness. Thus the Moroccan army made it over to Tunisia, where they were fighting to retain control until 1348. Historically they failed in retaining control, so they retreated to Tunis, which was already suffering from the plague. Eventually when these Moroccan soldiers returned to their capital Fez, they were carrying the plague and the whole of Morocco was greatly affected. In this alternate history I don't believe this to be the case, as the Moroccans would win the Battle of Río Salado, so their subjects would not revolt as much or be easily crushed, hence why the Moroccan army wouldn't catch the plague in Tunis and spread it to the mainland of Morocco. Still, due to trade it would eventually find its way, but I bet it would be much less devastating than historically, and Morocco is now much better off and politically stronger, so they can deal with it better, while historically it coincided with them kind of having a civil war. This is because historically they were changing rulers left and right, and there was plenty of instability, perhaps more so than in Iberia, which made the plague spread even faster, all of which is not the case here. As to summarize, Morocco is less affected by the plague, while Granada and Castile are about as much as historically, but Castile is more destroyed. At this point the Christian Iberian nations would be all fighting each other in this proxy war, and the Muslims are now in a position to exploit their weakness. Sure that each side of the Castilian Civil War was allied to a major power, but they were also fighting it out on the front lines and were themselves greatly devastated by the Black Death, so I don't see a possibility where France or England would send support against the Muslims down south. As such, Morocco and Granada would restart their hostilities towards Castile, potentially Portugal as well. There the Castilians are in no way able to resist, so they would start losing ground, with Cordoba being captured quite soon after this alternate conflict has started, while Portugal could lose the Faro province. In 1356 I would have the front lines to look something like this, and this Muslim involvement in Iberia would only make the region even more devastated, as Aragon, Portugal, France and England would all like to have peace of Castile, seeing their inevitable collapse, so tensions would be brewing and brewing fast. Still, I can see the Muslims to win in this war, where they would annex just about what is the modern-day Beja province of Portugal, but also everything south of the Guadiana river, where I can see Granada to eventually become a subject of Morocco, due to how strong the Moroccans would become, and how harshly the Emirate of Granada was hit by the Black Death. Still, as to not confuse you and have the Moroccan color be similar to that of Aragon, I would change it like so, and I think that now this looks much better. By the year of 1360, the borders in Europe would look something like this. England would have won the first phase of the 100 Years' War, signing the Treaty of Bretigny, while Henry of Trastamara, the French and Aragonese ally, is looking to win the Castilian Civil War like historically. England and France, despite not being at war, would continue to compete for influence over Castile, much like historically. But here one major event would change the history of the entire peninsula forever. The Anglo-Portuguese Treaty of 1376, which established the longest-lasting alliance in the world, could be signed a bit earlier, due to the different circumstances, Portugal being threatened and Castile being in a clear collapse, which the English could leverage as to prevent Castile from going over to their enemy of France. As such, somewhere in the 1360s, Portugal would be prompted by England to invade Castile, because the Castilians would be ruled by the pro-French Henry of Trastamara, while Aragon would be prompted by France to invade as well, just so they can counter the English, and Castile wouldn't be supported by anybody, except maybe the Muslims, who would like to keep them around as a buffer state, and prevent their enemies from growing stronger, but also take many Muslims rival soldiers with them, creating yet another proxy war in Iberia. The reason why France may abandon Henry of Trastamara is because at this point Aragon is going to become much stronger than Castile, and the Aragonese are going to want more land, or even establish a personal union over Castile, and therefore they can become the rulers of Spain later on, with their capital being in Valencia rather than Madrid. Now this proxy war would obviously go very hard against Castile, as the Muslims would support them just enough so they can kill some Portuguese and Aragonese with them, because the Muslims would know very well that once this fighting is over, these nations would turn on Morocco, so the Muslims would want to prolong this conflict as much as possible, as to keep themselves safe and prepare for the upcoming wars. In the end, I can see by 1370 for the civil war to end, and in the peace treaty, Portugal backed by England would expand into Galicia, with them having a lot of influence over Leon not being too impossible, which could become an independent state paying tribute to Portugal. This is important as England has holdings in the south of France, and this state could help them in the later war with France, which would have already started in 1369, which is the second phase of the 100 Years' War, also known as the Caroline phase, so Leon is likely dragged into that as well. As for Aragon, they would steal the Castilian influence in Navarre, but also greatly expand westwards ever so slightly, while making Castile a tribute-paying state. The reason why Aragon would take so little from Iberia is because they would mostly focus on the Mediterranean Sea, which is in Sardinia and Sicily, as trading was very profitable for them. Further, Aragon was historically not too committed to the Reconquista, which would now become a big deal. Finally, as to cover the Muslims, I can see them to expand south of the Tagus River, either as compensation for helping Castile out or simply taking it as there would be a power vacuum in the region. Internally, the Muslims would have to deal with a lot of rebellions, but they would overall be much stronger than the local Christians, due to the Black Death wiping many of them out, so the Muslims would actually outnumber them in Iberia, making it easy to consolidate these lands. There is likely a local Muslim governor that would rule over Christian villages and collect taxes, and the people there would eventually be forced to convert to Islam. So Morocco at this point I don't think would become overextended, but it depends on what happens next. As I think that Morocco would still establish their control over Tripoli, they would border the Mamluks, and as you can see from this map of Europe, the Ottomans would make their way over to the Balkans, so at this point the Christians would absolutely panic. The Muslims are starting to encroach on the European lands. For now, however, I don't see any crusades to be planned, as the Black Death would still prevent many Europeans from wanting to engage in wars. As I mentioned earlier, the Caroline War would still start, and France and England would be once more at war. But Aragon is now on the side of France, and Portugal is on the side of England. The Europeans would be desperate to achieve any sort of a victory, so they could be looking to make a deal with the devil, which is the Muslims in Iberia, trying to sway them over to their side just so they can achieve a decisive victory over the other. If this seems a little unrealistic to you, I want to tell you that I copied the way the Ottomans rose to power in the Balkans, as this is exactly what they did. Serbia, Bulgaria and the Byzantines were all fighting each other, much like how here it was Castile, Aragon and Portugal, and then the Muslims simply showed up and collected the spoils of war. I studied how the Ottomans rose to power and simply applied it to Morocco in this alternate history, taking advantage of their enemies all fighting each other, instead of working together against the greater threat. So, going back to the Caroline War, I would have the Muslims to go over to the side of France, due to them and Aragon so far not fighting directly, so relations would not be terrible, while Aragon, as stated earlier, was more focused on trade and not too much on Iberia, so it would make the two at least not hate each other. Meanwhile, Portugal would be very hostile towards Morocco due to their loss of lands, and the Muslims could be looking to easily expand further there. Another factor is that France was getting stronger, while England was growing unreliable in this phase of the war, so all these factors bundled together could make Morocco side with France, going on as to pacify Portugal. Now historically the French were able to defeat the British, which now with Aragon and a very strong Morocco on their side I feel like would be repeated, so the Truce of Leulingen would be signed, where France would take even more of England, and the front lines would freeze like this. On the other hand, Morocco would take Lisbon from Portugal, moving their capital to Porto. In the midst of the chaos, I can also see Castile to retake Leon. Going back to the Balkans, the Ottomans would have just won the Battle of Kosovo and expanded greatly into the Balkans, so two Muslim countries are about to conquer two vital peninsulas. They would be crusaded, that's for sure. The Europeans could split their attention and try to attack the Ottomans and Moroccans at the same time, which would be a terrible idea. Historically, in the 1396 Battle of Nicopolis, many Europeans tried to defeat the Ottomans, but they couldn't, and the Ottomans were victorious. Notice how France was involved, so they are unlikely to send too much to Morocco right away, so I think that the Europeans could still lose both crusades, or if they launched just one on Morocco, then the French wouldn't participate, further making the Moroccans win. At this point, a Moroccan-Ottoman Alliance absolutely would make sense. The Mamluks would be in the middle of both, and perhaps both would have ambitions on their territories, so this I think is a natural alliance that would begin to be very important later on. For now, let me cover the internal situation in Morocco. They would be filthy rich. Sure, the Europeans would hate them, but only the Moroccans had access to some resources like ivory, which they were getting from the west of Africa and selling it on the European market. But also Morocco had a lot of gold, so they are likely to prosper, especially since they would begin to dominate trade in the region. This would only expand more into their favor as time would go on. Going back to the 100 Years' War, in 1415 it would resume with the third phase, also called the Lancastrian War. Again, Morocco can play a vital role, either they side with France and finish off Portugal, or they would side with the British and seize plenty of Aragon, which would grow to become a lot more valuable than historically compared to Castile. I think that Morocco could see how France was sending over crusaders to the Ottomans and thus decide not to work with them. Not only is Aragon now a more valuable target than Portugal, but also if the Moroccans work with the French and France gets stronger, then the French could later crusade them, so the Moroccans at this point would be looking to weaken France, and rather would ally with England, both for their own safety and more valuable land that they could conquer. So there would be a civil war in France and a succession crisis, where Henry V of England would claim the French throne and send troops there. 5 years after the start of the conflict, England would control Brittany, Normandy and much of Burgundy, but also Flanders, while France would be clearly on the decline. All of this happened historically. The difference is that in this alternate history to the south, the Moroccans would seize most of Aragon, potentially successfully taking all of Valencia, while Castile could get involved on the side of France and Aragon. This is because they would finally be able to step on their feet and would like to reclaim lands from all of their neighbors, Galicia from Portugal, New Castile from Morocco and former western territories from Aragon plus Navarre. Historically, England was doing very well against France until Joan of Arc happened, but here the situation is quite different, as the French allies are quite weak and Morocco is growing to become really strong, and at this point surely being stronger than France itself on their own. As such, I can see Morocco to knock out Castile and Aragon out of the war and cause some trouble in France. Sure, the French could win against the English like historically, but this time it's very much different, and for the sake of the narrative of the scenario, we would have England to win due to France now being more devastated than historically. In the peace treaty, Morocco would gain all lands south of the Duero River, including from Castile and Aragon, plus Valencia, the Balearic Islands and Malta. England would get their personal union over France, which is something in itself could change the world history forever, and I'm currently making a video on that, so subscribe if this interests you, as this would be my next upload. Zooming out, this is what Europe currently looks like, and as you can see, the Ottomans and the Moroccans are greatly expanding, while the Europeans are unlikely to successfully crusade any of them, considering their previous attempts on the Ottomans and how now their attention would be split in two. England is likely shunned for having worked together with Morocco, so they could become Protestant a lot sooner and abandon Catholicism. And since Spain doesn't exist here, they are unlikely to invade England and send an armada over there. Now the Ottomans and Moroccans are likely going to continue expanding, but all of this gets hard to predict. Instead, I want to talk about something more interesting. Since the year in this alternate history would be around 1428, the fall of Constantinople would occur 25 years later, which I want to cover. But first, if it wasn't obvious enough, this scenario is bonkers already, as it is 100 years into the future, so obviously don't take it too seriously, always done for entertainment. With that being said, the Ottomans would eventually take Constantinople and consolidate the Balkans, while Morocco would expand some more uncontested, resulting in these borders near the end of 1453. Geographically, before the construction of the Suez Canal, the Mediterranean Sea had two entrances, the Straits of Gibraltar and the Dardanelles, both of which are now decisively controlled by the Muslims, who are also allied. This means that Morocco and the Ottomans would grow to become very wealthy from trade, where the Ottomans would occupy the Silk Road and put heavy taxes on the Christians, while Morocco monopolizes key West African resources, as it's impossible for the Europeans to get them otherwise. Thus both of these countries would get to become filthy rich, while the Christians would not like this at all. Historically, the Portuguese wanted to sail around Africa and find India, but look at them here. Surely they would have other priorities than finding a sea route to India. This is because their country is now so weak that they would be focused on defense rather than expansion, as even if they succeeded in finding a way towards India, it would eventually become very profitable, and thus the Moroccans could simply invade them and steal the route. Spain, which is Castile and Aragon if they choose to unite, which I honestly doubt, is also way too weak and similarly has other priorities than sail around the world and discover the new world. As such, in this alternate history, there is no big incentive for the Europeans to sail the oceans, due to the Muslims holding the choke points in the Mediterranean, so it would become mostly impossible. England and France, which are now in an unstable personal union, were historically very late to the colonization game, hence why for the first 150 years or so, Portugal and Spain got so much historically. Here I can see the English to have more pressing issues, so they would not be sailing expeditions either, so who is left to explore? The Italian states of Venice and Genoa likely have potential, but they need to pass through the hostile Straits of Gibraltar, which at any point could be shut down. So even if they find a trade route, it would not be effective, and the Muslims would steal it once more. This means that only the Kalmar Union has potential, but they would also be more interested in expanding in Germany and Russia. Thus, the Europeans are very much unlikely to discover the New World anywhere close to when it happened historically, due to all of these changes we have made so far. And remember, these discoveries initially made Portugal and Spain filthy rich, so the Europeans would be missing out on a lot of potential, while the Muslims would be doing even better than historically. Maybe the Ottomans would capture Vienna, maybe they expand into the south of Italy, maybe Morocco would expand way more, or maybe a coalition would finally bring them down. Regardless, the New World would be found centuries later than historically, which undeniably changes the whole colonization game, and how the natives can later on resist better. If you think that what I said is too extremely unrealistic, I want to point out that all I did was taking the rise of the Ottomans and applying it to the Moroccans in this alternate history, such as them taking a whole peninsula by the countries they are fighting each other, check. Controlling choke points, then raising taxes on the Christians and getting filthy rich, check. They would legitimize their rule by religion, with the Moroccans wanting to restore Al-Andalus, which they succeeded here, and the Ottomans framed themselves as the protectors of Islam, check. Both the Ottomans and these alternate Moroccans played Christian powers against each other, then expanded at their expense, check. Finally, both countries exploited the devastation that the Black Death had caused, allowing them to rise to power and fill in the power vacuum, check. All of this was allowed by the Europeans being exhausted by crusades, suffering greatly from the Black Death, and were all fighting each other. Morocco is the exact mirror image of the Ottomans, just in the Iberian Peninsula, so the two are quite similar. If you still find what I said unrealistic, I can point out how the Ottomans went from a very small state and conquered so much. The Habsburgs went from a small village in Switzerland to having a great empire. Russia was broken from the Mongols and united to become quite strong themselves. The fact is that history is unrealistic sometimes and very unpredictable, hence why this scenario I don't think is too unreasonable, at least in my opinion. Still, I find it difficult to continue, so much has changed, so I hope that you enjoyed it, and I suggest you take a look at this video where the Ottoman Empire never fell. Thank you for watching and I hope to see you there. Goodbye.